剩些相，七隻色狼靚女逐隻槍，過七條大巷，有心撳住槍，跟張咁跟興流做下章，社會裏街市最多實難盡講，總要執生米鬼上大當，一亂搶就差腳落堂。
In this video, I'm going to explore a fascinating and generally overlooked trend within Hong Kong Cantonese cinema that surprisingly only spanned around 3 years, from 1967 to 1970 to be exact. To the outside observer, like myself, these films were clearly just cheap sex comedies, but for historians like Ng Ho, who identified them as animal comedies, there is much more to them. Cantonese cinema has always maintained a sense of conservatism. Even the RFA teenage rebellious films from the late 1960s pandered to traditional notions of filial piety to some degree. But the Cantonese sex comedies, or animal comedies, well and truly pushed the industry's orthodox conventions to a completely different level. In the vein of the Carry On films from the UK, the Cantonese animal comedies targeted working class audiences, and indulged in risque comedic devices, almost always with Freudian undertones. This would have essentially been seen at the time as titillation, which concurred with the commonly held belief that during the 1960s, Cantonese cinema was unsophisticated compared to the Mandarin dialect productions. What intrigues me about this trend is how it reflected what was happening in Hong Kong during the 1960s. But I'm also interested in Ng Ho's use of animal comedy traditions, which may have originated in ancient Greece, as a framework to understand the trend more cohesively. He also identifies interesting correlations between Hong Kong society in the 1960s and Greece in the 3rd century, which could explain why these animal comedies materialised. As Ng states, animal comedies are products of a chaotic age, and both Hong Kong and ancient Greece were suffering plenty of chaos within their societies during these periods. Playwright Aristophanes observed in his old comedies how Greece was facing external and internal threats, and how the effects of war had reduced mankind to its most basic primordial instincts. Humans and animals were one and the same, transforming themselves into birds to reach the utopia of love and peace. Later on, the fables Aesop pushed the animal comedy approach even further, by depicting human weaknesses in the form of animal characters, forging explicit allegories between human deficiencies and the innate simplicity of primal urges. Hong Kong was going through one of its many historical calamities during the 1960s, and although the territory improved vastly regarding its economic development, the British administration's neoliberal economy nurtured an aggressive capitalist culture. This inevitably led to an obsession with materialism and the Hong Kong people seeing each other as a type of fiscal opposition. Accompanied with the growing gap between the rich and poor, a depressed property market, bank runs, and violent riots, socio-cultural chaos followed. During this turbulent time, full of anxiety and uncertainty, Ng claims sexual desire reached a peak, arguing, "Such a basic instinct is aroused because in moments of crisis, people think of procreating and leaving behind a new generation." The 1960s in Hong Kong saw the thriving of sex clubs, which began to reflect in the films produced. For the animal comedies specifically, new fetishes began to manifest that were not present in Cantonese cinema before, such as live women's wrestling and nude painting that we see in films like OK, and half-naked women polishing shoes in How the Strange Hero Tamed the Unruly Girl. According to critic Law Carr, all such scenes attested to the flourishing sex industry in Hong Kong at the time, where physical relationships were almost synonymous with materialistic commodities, no different to any other form of primal consumption. Obviously, for today's standards, this is extremely tame, but for Hong Kong Cantonese cinema during this decade, this was a racy reflection of the so-called popular entertainment of the time. The animal comedy places sex on the level of carnal desires. The male characters simply aim to fornicate with the female characters. Love or long-term romantic endeavours are not really factors. One of the most archetypical Hong Kong animal comedies is The Lucky Seven. It takes on the Snow White and Seven Dwarfs fable and immerses it within Freudian desires. The film is about 7 bawdy men who essentially compete in a game of sexual one-upmanship to see who can possess the body of Tina D. D was Hong Kong cinema's definitive sex symbol of the late 1960s and one of the main actors associated with the animal comedies, often playing the role of the over-sexualised Holy Grail that the lust-thirsty male characters want to consume. But as with most of the symbolism you find in these films, like the bed being the altar of sexuality and the penis frequently being used within wordplay and double meanings, there is much more to Tina D's sex goddess emblem. She's a sex warrior who fends off desperate and dirty men, and at the same time is an angelic nanny figure. The sexually competitive male characters in The Lucky Seven, who have no interest in love, proclaimed the collapse of morals and traditional values in crisis-laden Hong Kong. However, by the end of the film, moral order and traditional values are restored in some way. In both The Lucky Seven and its sequel, The Lucky Seven Strikes Again, only the straightest of the lustful men is the one worthy enough to win Tina D's body. This was likely due to, as with most of the animal comedies, the film pandering to the largely male-dominated audience. You could say the films aim to titillate the primal desires of men, but at the same time not threatening the sense of patriarchal order and hierarchy that they ultimately benefited from. This was demonstrated more explicitly in The Strange Hero Yat Chi Moi and its sequel, where the women who run a criminal organisation are finally overcome by the male hero, demonstrating clear misogynistic tones and reinforcing a cinematic world that has been constructed to lower women to the level of material commodities. They are, like food and alcohol, simply a substance designed to be devoured in a society dipping its toes into moral and cultural disorder. As far as I can tell, the phrase animal comedies was coined by film professor William Paul, which was initiated and typified by the North American raunchy comedies Animal House and Porky's. Paul professes that in these films, men's sexual desires are so obsessive that it actually surpasses that of other animals, stating, "It is possibly inescapable that the guys attending a bachelor party should think of sex, but in these films, high school and college students think chiefly of sex, summer campers think chiefly of sex, workers and members of a country club think chiefly of sex, soldiers think chiefly of sex, police trainees think chiefly of sex, even kibbutzniks think chiefly of sex. Only humans can be so single-mindedly concerned with sex. The donkey in bachelor party wants food, not sex." This motif is shown in a scene from King of Swindlers, where one of the male characters thinks one of his rivals is having sex with Tina D. He attempts to stab him, only to find it was a duck the whole time, trying to find food under the sheets, perfectly showcasing the notion that even animals' basic desire is for food nourishment, while for human men, it is sex. Without that, happiness is unobtainable. The male characters often work within an inner circle, and different social groupings means different objectives regarding their pursuit for fornication. The wealthy and socially high class seek sex and arousal as a means of distracting themselves from domestic norms and duties, likely a reflection of the corrupt political and economic elite in a Hong Kong immersed in chaos. The Chinese elites in the territory developed a negative reputation due to their close relationship with the colonial administration, but most importantly, encouraging the government not to tax the rich at a time when social welfare was still severely lacking. Ho also emphasised how the inner circles amongst the men have boundaries and deadlines. Similar to the more modern comedies like American Pie, the men have deadlines in reaching their sexual goals, losing their virginity by prom night specifically. In films like The Lucky Seven, the men have from 10 PM to 6 AM the next morning to sleep with Tina D's character. This psychological pressure paved the way for the character's humiliations and failures. Boundaries are important too, particularly how men, like various forms of animals, live together in groups, demonstrating some signs of pack mentality too. In The Lucky Seven and The King of Swindlers, the men share a rundown public apartment, which may have been a nod to Hong Kong's overwhelming housing crisis at the time. And in The Lucky Seven Strikes Again, they share a rooftop dwelling. This psychological balance of communal existence is disrupted when a sexy stranger infiltrates their space, and the men give in to their lustful urges. Thus, mutual conflict follows. According to Ng Ho, crossing boundaries in animal comedies means crossing into the realms of sexual acts of scenarios. This could be entering a bedroom, hiding inside a cabinet or under a bed, or peeping into a bathroom. What's interesting about Cantonese animal comedies is how crossing boundary rituals are born out of Chinese traditions. From offering animals to the gods in temples, to a bride stepping out of her family home into the bridegroom's house, all resembles rituals we find in these films. In The Lucky Seven, when preparing to enter Tina D's bedroom, the men prepare special foods and brews in an attempt to conjure supernatural forces that will gear their bodies and spirits up for sex. Animals on the chopping block are also significant in these films, often depicted as being more innocent and pure than the male characters. As I mentioned earlier, the duck almost being attacked in The King of Swindlers, or in OK, when the dove flies into a woman's dress to escape the human predators. There is also the more heavy-handed example in The Lucky Seven, where the turtle is boiled to increase the libido of the impotent men. However, these pure and honest animals sometimes bring humans hope. In OK, for example, Tina D is a mute who regains her voice when a dog runs away with her underwear, which for me suggests the men can be more animal than the animals themselves. According to William Paul, animal comedy is the product of an age that has tested the constraints of critical behaviour. But in this process of testing, and occasionally tearing down, these films almost inevitably, and for the most part unknowingly, ends up constructing new constraints of their own. As the 1960s ended in Hong Kong, this chaotic period began to settle in comparison, and the territory was somewhat on the road to recovery. The people needed a set of new social values and order. This was reflected in the animal comedies, because despite most of them being anarchic and riddled with chaos, some unconsciously attempt to seek new values and restraints. One of Ng Ho's examples to demonstrate this was One Day at a Time, which concludes with a song professing a type of 10 Commandments. The exhortations range from avoiding womanizing and gluttony to avoiding depending on your wife and showing off. The film ends with all of the characters entering a factory to contribute to Hong Kong's prosperity, showing that the territory's future could be a bright one. It could also be argued, however, that these sex comedies were simply a global film trend in the 1960s and 70s, and the Cantonese film industry followed suit, especially as at this point during Hong Kong history, the territory was beginning to be more susceptible to international influences, and the Cantonese film industry was in decline. So copying film trends from abroad would appear to be an effective way to keep it afloat within the cutthroat laissez-faire economy. But there is no doubt that these animal comedy films were a significant part of Cantonese cinema history in Hong Kong, and ultimately laid the foundation for the popular Michael Hui films and the Wong Jing chasing girl farces that would follow later on.